I want to welcome you to Thrive in the Word. You know, Thrive in the Word is a ministry of Thrive Ministries International, and we're doing this to help you to build your foundation in God. You see, we believe that the verse by verse or exegetical teaching of the Word of God builds a foundation in your life, and that's what we want to do. So today we're in the First John, the 5th chapter. And we're going to look at verse number 16. Now, let me just say this. If you haven't been listening, go back and listen to the prior videos. First John is a tremendous book of the Bible. It's written as a sermon. It's not written as a letter. It's written as a sermon, but it's written to people who are going through tremendous struggles. It's written to people basically in the area of Asia Minor. You know, John himself lived in Ephesus. John took Jesus' mother, and eventually he moved her to Ephesus and took care of her for the rest of her life. So he's writing to the people of that area, and that the people of that area at this time are going through tremendous persecution. They are being persecuted for their faith. But not only are they under the pressure of persecution, but they are also under the pressure of false teachers. People that are teaching all kinds of strange things in the churches. And so John is writing to people that I believe many of us today can relate to these people. I mean, I have never lived in a time where there's just an abundance of strange teaching. And I've never lived in a time here in the United States where the church is being persecuted like it's being persecuted today. I realize that Christians around the world are being persecuted, but we've not ever seen it like we're seeing it today in the United States. Now, John says something now in verse number 16. And this is what he says: if you see a fellow believer sinning in a way that does not lead to death, you should pray, and God will give that person life. Now, what's he saying? He's saying, if you see. Now, when John says this word see, he says it and it's a verb, but it's a verb that's in what we call the aorist tense. And this is very important because the aorist tense means you see it and you continue to see it. You see, John's not saying if you see a person and they're sinning, oh, I see that, oh, I saw that. You need to pray, you need, we have gotten so many strange ideas from those critical spirits. And what John is saying, if you see a person who's continuing to sin, now this person is a believer, it's not an unbeliever. This person is a believer, and you see them bound by sin. How many of you know that there are believers that are going to heaven without any doubt? They're going to heaven, but they're bound by sin in their life. What does John say? Now, when you see that person continuing to sin, go to the pastor and complain, and kick them out of the church. Get rid of them. No, that's not what it says. It says if you see a believer that's continuing to sin, they're sinning, it says pray. You pray. Now, John has just gotten done talking about praying and going with our request to God. Now, many times we take that personally, but you know what? John here is adding this little teaching, and he's saying when you see somebody, a believer, who is continuing to sin, you need to start by praying for them. Praying for them. And notice what John writes next. And God will give them life. Now, there's been some misconstrued teaching for many hundreds of years that if will pray, God will forgive them and God will take away their sin even though they're dead. You know what? This is one of the scriptures that they base that on. And that is not what it says. It says God will give them life. He didn't say that God would forgive them. He said that he'll give them life. In other words, they are going to continue to have the ability to change those areas of their lives. He will give them what they need to change. You see, the Zoe life of God, which is mentioned here, the Zoe life of God is given to us, not only to experience the blessing of God, but it's also to help us to rid ourselves of sin. And sin causes death. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Now let's go back to verse number 16. But there is a sin that leads to death. Now, what's John talking about? Now, I'm not going to go into great depth about this sin that leads to death. But I believe that the unpardonable sin is something that's committed only by believers. And basically what the unpardonable sin is this, is that they know and they have experienced all that God has. They've experienced the power of God. They've experienced the life of God. And then they turn around and they purposely say to God, I don't want any of this anymore. That's the sin that leads to death. It's the unpardonable sin. You see, all other sin is pardonable, but that one sin is not pardonable. Now, you can disagree with me, and I give you the right to be wrong. Back to verse number 16, and I hope I haven't lost a whole bunch of people there. But I am not saying that you should pray for those who have committed it. He's saying there's some people that they've said, Jesus, I don't want anything to do with you anymore. I don't want your salvation. I don't want anything. I'm turning my back on you. And by the way, these are believers, according to the book of Hebrews. These are believers who have tasted of the power of God and a whole bunch of other things that's listed there. And they've turned their back on Jesus. Verse number 17. All wicked actions are sin. In other words, all sin, all wicked actions, it's called sin. And it says, but not every sin leads to death. We need to understand that the only sin that leads to death is to reject what God has done for you. Don't do it. Don't reject what God has done. I hope that you listen to us again, and God bless you. That's our prayer for you.